Welcome back, everyone, for session 7. God works through his people from Judges 4, reworking that title into Deborah, a new Moses. As I said before, with respect to the cycle of the Judges, it's important to appreciate for the Judges that we have an expanded story on. Some of them are barely mentioned by name and how long they judged, and then we move right on. We need to slow down and pay attention to the details, and there are many details with respect to this story that are just almost point for point on par with comparing Deborah to Moses. Case in point, back to Exodus chapter 3 and verse 7. This is what the Lord tells Moses as he reveals himself at the burning bush. I've heard them crying out unto me because of their oppressors. So Israel is purposefully enslaved because this is what Yahweh said to Abraham back in Genesis 15 when he was still Abram, that this is in the destiny of these people to be taken out of the land, led so by his hand, as of course Jacob is going to be the embodiment of that. When the Lord tells him it's okay for you to go and see your son Jacob, Joseph there, and you will die there, and I will gather you unto your people, but I will bring them out, as he also promised Abram. But in Judges chapter 4 with Deborah, the Israelites are crying out to the Lord because they are rebelling against Yahweh, and he's allowed oppressors to be raised up against them to essentially enslave them within the land. So they are experiencing exile, much the same way Israel was experiencing exile in the land of Egypt. So Israel is experiencing exile, almost a form of house arrest in their own land. They can't enjoy the fatness and the goodness of it because Yahweh is bringing trouble on them because of their willful rebellion against him. Back to Exodus chapter 1, the Egyptians are oppressing them with forced labor. Here in Judges chapter 4, verse 3, this is how the story begins, that Jabin, who is the king of Hatzor, has harshly oppressed them now for 20 years. So quite some time, right, for them to finally come around to getting their act together and crying out to the Lord. We go back to Deuteronomy chapter 34, and granted, I know this is jumping all over the place, but Moses' story is spread out with respect to the details that covers 3.5 books of Torah, whereas with this story of Deborah, it transpires over just 2 chapters. So we are told that in the final act of Moses, after he's dead, that no prophet has arisen again in Israel like Moses. But I chose this verse because it's one that very clearly and concisely highlights the fact that Moses was seen and accorded the honor of a prophet. Deborah is raised up as a prophetess. She's not like Moses in the sense that she fulfills all the parameters of that job description, but nonetheless, she is accorded as a prophetess and is indeed raised up in Moses' stead, right? And we know this because when we look back to Exodus 18, we see the activity that Moses engages in with the people of Israel encamped around Sinai. And this is what his father in law Jethro observes. The next day, Moses sat down to judge the people. That's interesting that this word is used of Moses when this is the word that is repeatedly used of characters like Deborah and Gideon and Samson and so forth, and all the rest of these judges. So this is exactly the same thing that Deborah is doing, right? We find her introduced to us in Judges 4 as being the one who comes and sits under the palm tree named after her, and her job is essentially to do what Moses does in Exodus 18. Jethro comes to Moses at the end of the day and says, "What are you doing and why are you doing it?" And he says, "Well, whenever the people have a dispute, they all bring these disputes to me, and I instruct them with respect to what Yahweh's expectations are and his commands are so that they will know the law of Yahweh." And this is what Deborah's doing as a prophetess, not just foretelling the future, but foretelling Yahweh's word with his authority to his people. She is judging the Israelites and the disputes that they have. Now, when we go back to Exodus 17, we hear Moses saying to Joshua, "Select some men to go and fight against Amalek." It's interesting because this is exactly what Deborah is doing to Barak. She summons Barak and then she says, "Hasn't the Lord commanded you to take your armies and go and fight against Jabin and the armies of Hatzor to defeat them because the Lord has handed them over to you or placed them into your hands?" So just like Moses directs the person, Joshua, who is the commander of his troops, so does Deborah. Then when we look back to the events of Exodus 14, the crossing of the Red Sea and the destruction of Egypt in the midst of the sea, we see that as they were trying to escape, the Lord divinely intervenes and he throws them into the sea. Well, look at this. The Lord threw Sisera and all his army into a panic before Barak. So we have a hyperlink almost in the exact same phraseology of what we have in Exodus 14 being used, But the idea is that as the Lord caused mass chaos to break out amongst the Egyptians, and they panic because their wheels are stuck and they can't get out of there quick enough, and then the walls of water come crashing down. Now the Lord has caused the armies of Sisera, the commander of Jabin's troops, the leader of the armies of Hatzor and the surrounding territories that are under Jabin's control, into a great panic as they are out in the open battlefield against Barak, leading Barak to great victory. So, as the Lord decimated Egypt through Moses, he is destroying Sisera through Deborah, right? And then we could work through the rest of these examples here. Not one of them even survived. In Exodus chapter 14, the same is said here. Barak pursued the whole army, and not a single man was left. Yet again, drawing us back to this Exodus story, and as we saw in a few lessons prior to this, how God parts the nation sea. So as that happened in the days of Joshua, yet it's happening on a smaller scale, but a repeat of what Joshua did when he destroyed the northern coalition under the headship of Hatzor, as they were the leader kingdom of the time. The same is said here, as that kingdom has been reconstituted, and now control of it perhaps was either never seized fully by Israel. The land was decimated, and so was its kingdom, but the people of Israel tried to move into that area and take control of it. And there was enough left of a remnant who perhaps temporarily left the land to the north and escaped into the territory of the Hittites to then come back down into the land once the armies of Israel pulled back from the area and were able to resettle it. And then, of course, when a smaller tribe tried to come up there and take it from them, they were able to fend them off. Don't know, but either way, it's yet again Hatzor that is the head of the snake that must be dealt with here. So back to Exodus 14, that day the Lord saved Israel from the power of the Egyptians. And in the story of Deborah and Barak, that day God subdued King Jabin before the Israelites. And then, of course, this leads Moses to sing the victory song, the song by the sea of Exodus 15, how the Lord stretched out his right hand and the earth swallowed up the Egyptians in the heart of the sea. And of course, Deborah leads maybe not all of Israel, but a portion of them in the song that she sings right after this, that the Lord who came from Mount Seir in Edom, when he did, the earth trembled with the quaking of his footsteps. Again, Moses leading the song of triumph, as does Deborah. So I think it's important to help us frame this up for our students, at least with that at the beginning of the lesson before we choose to move on to something else. And the reason is because all of this is building up to give greater credence to how Matthew, at the beginning of the New Testament canon, is going to be framing Jesus up as yet another Moses. If we fail to do this, it might seem a little bit disjointed for our students to come to realize that that's what Matthew's doing in the Gospel of Matthew, and it negates or just passes over all of these other stories in the Old Testament where these highlights are easily picked up on by the reader of the text if we're paying attention. So we as teachers have something of a responsibility to point that out. But we'll go into greater depth and detail of this when we get to our Wednesday night session. Tune in for the next lesson.